Hello everybody, welcome back to The Overlap. If you don't know who I am Harrison and I host The Overlap Breakdown Show, which is a show that is part of The Overlap, which covers the tactical details of the week-by-week Premier League and European football in action. And I do that with my co-host here, who's Umir, who's a professional football scout and analyst. And today we're here to break down the tactics behind why Chelsea have just become world champions. Right, hello to the brand new audience. For those who don't know, me and Umir host a show called The Overlap Breakdown, which is a series where we take a look at the more in-depth details about a beautiful game, and we sort of go into stuff statistically and analytically and, most important, tactically. And today we're here to cover Chelsea and what they managed to do on Sunday against PSG, which was quite amazing. 3-0 against the current Champions League holders and a team that have won the treble in the season coming up to this. So a very impressive performance from Chelsea, and we're going to get into just how they managed to do that when we're talking about their in possession, what they did on the ball that's, sort of surprised PSG, and some of their work out of possession, which shows Moresca's tactical flexibility. But just before we go into it, I want to talk to you. We mentioned on our channel, which if you do want to go to our channel, don't forget to click the link in the bio, which will take you there. But if you want to talk about how Moresca was sort of labelled as a bit more of a rigid manager, and coming into this season, it was a bit frowned upon what we would get in second season Moresca, because we haven't seen that yet in his managerial career. But what have you made of sort of some of the tweaks that Moresca's made in regards to the personnel?
Look, Moresca, he had a lot of pressure on him when he first joined Chelsea, and there were some question marks about his style. We know that from his previous jobs, he tends to favour a more heavy possession style, and he likes to kind of be rigid in the way he tends to play. But given that he was handed a team that are really good in transition, he had to sort of balance the two styles. He went a little bit towards that more heavier possession style towards the end of this season, and then he's still shown the acumen to be able to kind of showcase that transitional quality in certain tactical tweaks, in the personnel choices as well, against his PSG side. And we'll get into it in full detail throughout this video, but the likes of Cole Palmer really shone playing on those big spaces that were available when Chelsea went a bit more direct against PSG.
Yeah, so if you want to lead us right on into talking about what Chelsea did that was completely different to what we'd seen from Moresca pretty much for the entire of the Premier League season. And in this game, they only had 34% of the ball, which in terms of a Moresca team is very low, and we don't often see that from Chelsea. But we noticed something that was very brand new, and it was something to take advantage of Nuno Mendes, Kvaratskhelia, Beraldo, who was in there for William Pancho. And I want you to sort of cover what that was and why Chelsea had so much success with just this one pattern. I think it directly led to the first and second goals.
So if you look at the in-possession stuff that Chelsea did that was so impressive, it was this right-hand side that essentially won them the game, in my opinion. They started with a back four on paper, and they were playing against a man-to-man press across the pitch in PSG's sort of defensive structure. This is aiming to highlight that, and the midfield is where I want to focus on in particular. You're looking at Caicedo here and Reece James here. Reece James playing in central midfielder as a central midfielder, which is obviously not necessarily his main position, but he's played there in the past, and he was brilliant there against PSG. Enzo Fernandez as that third midfielder, almost as a number 10 at times, but generally leaning towards the left. And they were marked man-to-man. It were these deep movements from the double pivot of Chelsea that essentially left Vitinha kind of as a lone number 6. Now, given the man-to-man pressure of PSG across the pitch, you don't really have any areas where you're getting sort of a free man to then exploit the space. And it was this clever movement that Moresca instructed for his Chelsea side that allowed them to get sort of free players. And it was the upward movement of Gusto that meant that Mendes couldn't follow Cole Palmer into these areas. So Gusto really high and wide, and at times Mendes was a little bit deeper to keep this back four, more compact and more structured. But look, he was forced to come out to Gusto, and he couldn't follow Cole Palmer in those situations. That essentially gave Chelsea this 4v3 in midfield, and with the PSG players instructed to follow all of their players around the pitch, Cole Palmer was your free man, and that's why he was so dangerous in this game. Now, when you're building up with your 3 at the back and with Sanchez as well, probably as the spare player, because everyone else is obviously marked again, then it's not enough to have a free man. How are you going to get the ball to him in this situation? And it was the brilliant long passing quality of Sanchez that found him in Gusto often. And when Nuno Mendes was pulled out, Gusto often beat him 1v1, which was really impressive and something that I was
Yeah.
quite surprised by. And if he didn't come out, then Gusto could go himself.
Yeah.
Alternatively, there were movements in behind, given PSG played this high line, and those movements in behind were found directly from Sanchez rather than aiming to go to feet all of the time. And those two players on that right-hand side were remarkable. That passing quality on show was remarkable. And I think the pitch, the quality of the pitch and the heat as well, held the ball up when he did go long, and that benefited Chelsea again. So those movements, those schemes, that right-hand side, and that tactical plan in general, really impressive. And it really got the better of that PSG side.
Yeah, I think when you were just mentioning then, the one thing that was going through my mind, especially if Nuno Mendes kind of had these situations most of the time where Gusto would do this thing where like he creeps up the pitch ever so slowly. And there's this one moment in the game when Moresca was actually pointing at him to creep up. And I think when you're in this situation and Palmer's a bit narrower and Gusto's there, Nuno Mendes can't follow both of them at once.
Yeah.
So he's asking the question of Beraldo, who's the left centre-half in this occasion, to actually follow Palmer. But the key role for one of the players in this system was João Pedro. And I think he was very much leaning on this side and almost pinning Beraldo back. So it meant that Beraldo couldn't jump past, because if he did, Pedro would spin him behind, which eventually we saw for his goal. And I think, in general, I think it was a somewhat masterful plan from Moresca. I think the way he looked at it, the way it looked like Nuno Mendes was the weak link, but he was also taking advantage of Kvaratskhelia tracking back. He often
didn't drop in
was
as
often
much.
really, really poor in terms of checking if Gusto had gone past him. I think Nuno Mendes actually, you could hear him screaming at Kvara on one of the situations, and Beraldo as well is obviously a backup left centre half for PSG. And I thought Nuno Mendes to target him after the campaign he's had was incredibly brave, but I think if you attack the entire side of a system, might be one of the best players who takes the fall. But eventually, they got it bang on. And I think, in terms of Moresca in possession, I think this pattern for them only having 33% of the ball, as we said before, I don't think it got any better than that for Chelsea.
Yeah, when we touched upon that 33 or 34% possession in general, they did all of their dangerous work in the first 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah.
The rest of the game, they kind of sat in and forced PSG to answer questions that they find hard to answer in general.
Yeah.
PSG are really good at attacking the big spaces as well, like Chelsea are.
Yeah.
So they didn't necessarily need to have the ball in general. So a great in possession setup, and without the ball as well, defended really impressively, which we'll get onto now.
Okay, now moving on into Chelsea out of possession. We thought it was only fair to start with what Chelsea actually planned to do in the first 5 or 10 minutes and why it actually stumped PSG quite crucially in the game. So, as you can see, PSG usually build up with this somewhat 4 plus the goalkeeper and then 1 single pivot. And what we have here is Enzo Fernandez was actually stood on the same line as João Pedro. And what it meant was when the ball would move here, he could drop off there. But if the ball was here and he was a bit deeper, he could step up, and then we call these somewhat hybrid roles. These players then pass on the roles, jumping to the nearest ball-sided player. So if this player is closer to the ball than this player, and he's jumped over here, we want to get in front of that, and that's a hybrid role. Palmer had a very similar role where he would actually somewhat leave the left-back Nuno Mendes virtually free, but as Fabian Ruiz and Ousmane Dembele in particular like to drop in these spaces, he was a lot more narrower. But if the ball was worked out here, he can jump here, and then his teammates can obviously jump in front. So initially from the high press, Chelsea actually forced PSG long quite often, and it's very hard to actually go man-to-man against PSG because of how fluid they are, as we've seen in the Champions League, and especially when they've got a false 9 player like Dembele. And Dembele was getting followed very, very deep by Trevor Chalobah, who had a really good game as well, and it meant that the left-back and right-back were literally playing 2v2 at the different ends of the pitch on their own in no man's land. And it was a really aggressive plan from Moresca, but can you tell me why it was Chelsea this time who stumped them more than any other team they've played? Was it the physical levels? Yeah. Was it something in between the lines in the plan?
So look, I think in general, teams are a bit afraid to kind of press PSG with that intensity because they can pass it around. There's so many rotations, like you mentioned. If you give PSG players even a second, they will play around you. They've got that one-on-one quality to dribble past you and then get into attacking positions. And that's kind of the biggest flaw of a man-to-man defensive system. When you look at this Chelsea side, they kind of implemented what Bayern Munich did so well against PSG in the Club World Cup. Eventually in that game, PSG ended up winning, but it was Bayern Munich's press and the intensity of the pressure that was really, really good and really strong. I think there's a brilliant quote from Moresca, I don't know if you have it, about the intensity and just how much that they sort of focus on that to set the tone of the game.
Yeah. So Moresca actually said that in the first 10 minutes, the key idea from a Chelsea perspective was to apply maximum pressure inside the first 10 minutes, because they knew that if they could almost, trick PSG into thinking that they can't play out against Chelsea because of how intense the pressure was, then the game would automatically land in Chelsea's hands, whether it be the dueling in midfield, sort of the physical matchups they had in the back line. And Chelsea did that. I think we watched the game just before we started filming, and I think PSG started to go long with their goalkeeper kicks inside 8 minutes.
Yeah.
And from the moment you start going long against a team like Chelsea, when they've got players, sort of PSG, but Chelsea have got players who can run into big spaces, as we've seen for the goals, then you are in trouble. Okay, lastly, moving on into Chelsea's deep block against PSG. So as we know, we just mentioned them pressing high in the first 10 minutes, but then what happened gradually over the game is PSG started to sort of increase their height on the ball in terms of being up the pitch. And Chelsea are this team who have defended really compact under Moresca, and they don't really look to jump out of the block too much. But I want to show you specifically what they did in this game, and they have shown it a few times in the Premier League just gone, how they've been, how they were so good defensively in this game. So as you can see, we've got Pedro Neto, who's playing left wing here, and we've got the standard back four on paper. But what actually happened is when PSG got, higher up the pitch, we've seen Pedro Neto swing to more of these left wing back positions, and that meant that the back line would shuffle. And now we can see that Chelsea have gone man-to-man with PSG's front five. So if you can imagine, this is Ousmane Dembele. We've got probably the two full-backs in the half spaces, and then we've got the wingers holding width on either side. Now, what's really interesting about PSG and what they got so many plaudits for in the Champions League run and even in the league was how fluid they are in this shape. So we can see that it's the 3-2-5 that majority of elite teams are using, but their uniqueness is their ability for this player to move everywhere. So we're talking about these moving here, picking up the ball. We're talking about them rotating with a midfielder, coming getting the ball inside midfield. Can they go out wide? Yeah, they can. They can do everything, these fullbacks, just because of how unique they are. Now, what that meant Chelsea were doing was, if this player would drop here, that means that Trevor Chalobah, who was actually the man who was responsible for sort of these right pocket players, would step out, and then another player who would rotate in. So let's say if it's this left central midfielder, he would then get tracked by Cole Palmer. And what that meant is that Chelsea never ever lost numerical dominance across the pitch. They always had a 5v5 in the back line against PSG's 5 attackers. Whether that was Nuno Mendes, Barcola when he come on, Kvara, it didn't matter. They had 5v5, and even though it was Cole Palmer sometimes at right centre half, it meant that Chelsea could always keep that shape. What I want to touch on just before we move on to the final bit is that PSG have become sort of famous for using these flying fullbacks. Yeah. Hakimi and Nuno Mendes are very much width holders. They attack, they score more goals than many fullbacks in the world. But what it means is when you've got all your fullbacks pushed into the final third, Chelsea meant they could gamble on PSG turning over the ball deeper and then counter-attacking through this space. So if we've got a 3-2 build-up here and Chelsea's wingers are staying high and they're gambling on these players turning the ball over, it means that if Cole Palmer gets here, the man who he's playing up against here is Beraldo and not Nuno Mendes, which is very much more favourable of a foot race than against Nuno Mendes. And that is somewhat of a drawback with having really attacking fullbacks. We've seen City compromise this by putting the fullbacks into midfield, and we still have them athletic profiles here to regain the ball. But if it's a left centre half like Beraldo, who's not as fast and not as strong as Nuno Mendes, it leaves a favourable matchup. And Chelsea scored a goal from turning over the ball in this 5-2-3 and gambling with the 3 forwards, staying high, then running into the space. And if you can imagine, we've got Cole Palmer, João Pedro, and it was actually Enzo Fernandez who played this further up pro as Pedro Neto was down there. It's a method that I've seen Thomas Frank use. It's often referred to by myself as the back 5 chain, and how can we create that chain? And I thought they did it really, really well, and they only conceded 0.4 XG to PSG's 8 shots I think they had. So yeah, remarkable from Chelsea, both on the ball, off the ball. They found out PSG's weaknesses, bolstered their own strengths, and it was one of the most impressive one-off game performances I've seen in recent times, especially in terms of the disparity in the levels between the two teams. So I wanted to ask you, just before we wrap up, what are you expecting of Chelsea next season?
I think if they can balance all parts of what they've shown at times, then they can certainly be up there as one of the best teams in the league. We've seen them play good, methodical football in sort of this heavier possession style of play, and they've got the individual quality to now, I think, break down stubborn defences. in the past, it was probably only Cole Palmer as that main player trying to unlock and unpick defenses. But if you've got someone like Reece James fit and firing, he's brilliant at creating and, you know, forcing goals as well. Yeah, Pedro, whether he's doing it sort of in bigger spaces, but also against stubborn defenses as well, he's another player who can kind of give you an answer. Gittins, we know, is a brilliant 1v1 dribbler, and he can force the issue again on that side. So it seems like they're prioritizing individual quality to make sure they win games against stubborn defenses. I think if they can add this sort of game and performance to their general season against teams that perhaps like to play with the ball a little bit more, or perhaps don't have the players who can defend or counter-attack, if they can sit in certain games and then play on the quality of Cole Palmer and Gusto pushing up and Pedro or Liam Delap in transition, then those two parts together will make them a really dangerous outfit, given that they can build on what was generally a quite successful last campaign. And yeah, Moresca's really impressed me. I think they're moving in the right direction, and I'm really excited to see how they do play next season.
I really like how much Moresca's sort of inviting on this flexibility with the time and the personnel. We mentioned before how we've not seen a second season Moresca, and I was a bit not worried, but if he was going to stay with that somewhat rigid style of play from last season. But he does seem to be incrementing a few changes here and there. I think he tried to play 4-2-2 towards the start of the Club World Cup, but yeah, really liking what I'm seeing from Moresca. I hope I can see more flexibility, and he's putting his, as we like to say, he's putting his best players in their best positions, and that usually means you win football matches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this episode of The Overlap, please don't forget to click the link in the description to take you towards the Overlap Breakdown channel. And if you did enjoy, please don't forget to like, comment, and follow the channel. And we'll be back next week for some more analysis.